I never dreamed of being a writer when I grew up because I was like, oh, no, it's too impractical. At least that's what I told myself. I was going to be a scientist instead.
I grew up in Indiana, and then I went to college in Indiana, and then I moved to Los Angeles to become something.
I told myself that I had to pick one, writing or science, so I picked science.
I worked in post-production. I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be in a rock band, and I wanted to be, and I wanted to write.
It was easy to pick something that didn't make people ask, are you sure you can make a living doing that?
So I did a lot of all of that, and all of it at like a 80 or 70%.
And it was easy to pick something that didn't involve inviting strangers to pass judgment on something that was very important to me.
I had a stack of screenplays that I would just add to every day, or not every day, but I would write one and then never show it to anyone.
And I didn't ever, all through schooling, in college and graduate school, ever want to admit to myself how much fear there was in that decision of picking the thing that was not writing, picking not writing.
I wouldn't try to get an agent. I wouldn't try to put myself out there.
I was terrified of being told I wasn't good enough.
I did make a couple short films with friends, and so anytime I'd work with friends, that was my vibe. But I never really threw myself out there.
I was so terrified that I didn't let anybody tell me that I was anything. I just didn't send my stories out. So I studied geology in college. I actually did the science thing.
It wasn't until I started writing novel-length fiction that I finally found something I wanted to do 100%.
I earned my PhD in 2007, which, as you know, was right before the global financial meltdown.
Through therapy and years of aging well, I've learned some things about myself, and one of which is I like to be discovered. I like to kind of labor in obscurity with the idea that someone is going to pluck me out of the crowd.
I was still writing fiction, but I was still not taking it seriously. I kept telling myself, this is a hobby, this is a hobby. But there came a point.
The sad part of that is that's the kind of thing that keeps you only working 80% at something.
Where my thinking started to change. And it wasn't just one thing that made it change. It was this whole circumstance. Started to think, what the hell have I got to lose? I'm already depressed and unemployed and living in my sister's basement. Why not try to publish?
And so in a weird way, my first agent I was discovered. Ooh, right?
Like, what am I afraid of? I've already, sent out 7,000 resumes to companies that don't even answer.
So this is where being discovered, that know yourself thing, that need to be discovered, can become a weakness.
So I decided to try to take it seriously.
I didn't realize my agent at the time was an amazing editor, but not a great agent.
Every story needs a beginning. We all know that. But the story of becoming a writer, of getting to the point where it is part of your identity and part of your work that you do, it never only has one beginning.
I was so happy to have an agent. I never did the work to find out if that was an agent I wanted.
It has dozens of beginnings.
I didn't get an MFA.
It begins when a little girl sits down to type a few sentences about creatures that only exist in her head.
I wrote when I was in high school, kind of.
It begins when a teenager reads something that she likes and decides to try her own hand at it.
Somewhere in Indiana in a landfill, there is a spiral notebook of a poorly handwritten serial killer novel.
And it begins when a 30-something woman finds herself depressed and unemployed in her sister's basement and realizes that rejection letters can't possibly be any more soul-crushing than looking for a job in the middle of a global recession.
I hope no one ever finds it, because they're just going to think it's the writings of a serial killer.
One of the great and terrible things about being a writer, once you decide to do it, you have to keep deciding to do it over and over and over again. It never is just one decision.
So anyway, I actually ended up with the second agent. And he was great. He was with a big New York office.
You can't just make the decision once. You're making the decision every time you sit down to spend time writing rather than doing something else.
And he took the book out right away, the original manuscript right away, to the majors. And he went to 8 people at once and got wonderful rejections.
Publishing is a weird, messy, arcane, mysterious business.
Where they actually sound like great notes. He actually got feedback of we would love this if that third act didn't do this.
It's full of pitfalls and booby traps that you never expect. They have like weird secret societies and rules.
We love everything about this book except for the plot.
It's a crazy business.
Like the next thing this author has, we want to read, just not this.
But it is also a business that is full of room for people to be as creative as they want to be.
And so he was like, do we want to go to mediums and smalls?
I started out with sci-fi and fantasy short stories.
I'd finished the first draft of my second manuscript. And I actually took that moment and said no.
Then I published a couple of novels for teenagers.
I was finally at an age where I was realizing it's okay to take another year to do this right.
Then I wrote a middle grade children's fantasy novel.
I didn't want to settle with that debut novel at a lower level than I might have.
And now I'm working on my second adult sci-fi horror thriller.
Because also I knew the second book was better.
So I know from the outside, it looks a little bit less like a actual career path and more like a slightly dangerous game of pin the tail on the donkey.
You know, the first manuscript I'd written over, depending on if you include the screenplay, could have been 10 years. But more so as like a 5-year period where it was refining and getting better and better. The second one I wrote in 2 years.
From a purely practical standpoint, it does provide some challenges. And it doesn't do me or anybody who is trying to do that any good to ignore those challenges.
So then eventually we thought it was ready, and my agent loved it. He had some notes. Here's what I didn't know. Still, 6-7 years into the process, I wasn't sure if I was writing a thriller or a mystery because I didn't know there was a difference.
If you want to write for teenagers, for example, you have to learn about teenagers the same way you would learn about detectives to write crime fiction, or scuba divers to write a treasure hunting novel, or 1820s debutantes to write a Regency romance.
It was the kind of thing where you maybe intuit, but you never really thought about. And of course, once you're in a mystery, there's hard-boiled, there's noir, there's hard-boiled, there's procedural, and there's cozy. But in a thriller, there's suspense, there's paranormal, there's crime thriller, there's tech thriller, and more, and many more. And I had no idea.
The generosity in reading is you're not going in assuming that you already know what every detective or scuba diver or debutante or teen cheerleader is like. You're going to learn that because part of being a writer is constantly being willing to learn.
So I finally was kind of realizing that, and then my agent actually said, hey, by the way, I don't rep mysteries, I rep thrillers.
Read for story voice, read for structure, read to understand tropes and how they are embraced or subverted in a particular genre, because the tropes that are embraced in a spy novel are very different from the tropes that are embraced in a teen novel.
And so he's like, the first half of your book is a mystery, the second half is a thriller. Pick which one you want it to be.
And you have to know what the audience already knows in order to find something fresh and new for them.
But also I don't rep mysteries.
So read for the emotional hook behind the story.
By the way, the difference between, in simplest forms, the difference between a mystery and a thriller, a mystery is what happened and why.
But pay attention to how it's different between genres.
A thriller is what's happening right now and what will happen.
Because it always has to be there, even if you maybe don't think it's as important, depending on what you're writing.
So I rewrote it once again, and he then took it to market.
Science fiction needs an emotional impact. Spy novels need emotional impact.
I had that first call with an acquiring editor, and what was magical about it is it was the first time someone I had no ties to loved the character and believed in it right away and was excited about it and had exciting ideas about it and was like, I can't tell you more unless you sign a contract.
But a coming-of-age story might have a very different emotional kind of arc than a serial killer thriller, but they still need to have it there.
I'd learned the craft. I'd worked on the craft. I was at a point where I was beta reading for lots of people, and I felt like I knew how to kind of give story notes and how to give craft style notes. And now I got to the industry that I had not spent much time learning about.
Without that emotional hook, you don't really have a story. You just have a lot of words that are strung together on a page.
Finally, I got to that point of like, well, I still don't really understand what happens once you sign the deal.
Something that I just started understanding maybe 2 years ago, 5 years now into my career, was that we don't sell stories. You might think you're selling stories, you sell emotion.
Now, anyone who's gone through self-publishing knows, because they've had to do it themselves or they've worked with an indie publisher, and not to confuse the two, obviously indie publishing is different, but the there's a lot that goes into it.
Whether you're writing romance or thriller, action, adventure, fantasy, your readers are feeling something when they're reading that book.
So right away you're talking about marketing stuff.
Or ad
So-
copy.
And you're talking about, what's the tagline for the book?
Ad copy is also selling emotion because we're not logical beings. We buy on impulse. We buy on emotions.
And what's the cover flap look like?
If you are selling to me the practicality of a story, that's nice. This guy, and that guy wrote the same kind of thing.
And what does the artwork look like?
But if you sell me more of the emotion in that, whether that's in the ad copy, what I see on Amazon or Facebook, or in your product description on Amazon, also known as a blurb, or your Amazon sales copy, don't give me the plot points.
People are looking for insight, hope. Sometimes they're just looking for excitement or entertainment, a few hours of escape. Sometimes they want some catharsis.
I'm not that interested in the plot points. It's not going to be what triggers me. It's going to be what is the character arc and what is the emotion that I feel like I'm going to experience. And then once you've sold me on that, I can't help but click buy.
They're looking for something, and you have the ability to give that to them.
And by the way, we need all of this by certain times.
So Amazon has genres, and then within the genres there are categories, and within the categories there are subcategories, and Amazon is going 5 categories deep in some of their genres now.
Not only do stories matter, and stories have always mattered since the first proto-humans sat down around the first campfire.
And then even with historical romance, what part of history is it in? Is it Highlands? Is it Regency? Is it Western? Like, where does it fall?
But that our stories matter, our voices matter.
The main image, the style of image, the font, the typography, the name, if you're using a pen name, the colors, all of that conveys in an instant what the reader is going to take from that and communicate. This is the kind of book I am, this is the kind of feeling you're going to get, and this is whether or not I fit in with the rest of the group here.
Amidst all the screaming and fear and shouting and anger in the world, to take the mess of the world around us, and the world has always been messy and will always be messy, to take all of that and to shape it into something beautiful, that is still an art that matters.
Our artistic side gets out in the story. That's where it's fun for us. We love to write. That's why we're here. That's why we're learning. That's what we're doing. But the business side, you need to take a step back and realize it doesn't matter necessarily what cover you think is great. It matters what cover the consumer thinks is great. Your cover has to fit whatever genre you're in, right?
Long story short, I wrote the second book in 3 months. And it's better than the first one, I think. So what does that mean?
And being a writer in this world, in an uncertain industry that is changing way faster than publishing houses know how to adapt to it.
Going back to all those years we didn't know what we were doing. We were just throwing our books up and hoping for the best. And now we understand that there's a science behind it. We're not creating books, we're creating products.
That means that the learning curve is steep when it happens, but you can rise to it.
Means having to find ways to remember every day that the things we make up in our head can and do actually mean something to somebody out there.